Pesetsky from MIT. So I'm happy to welcome everybody to our Distinguished Linguist series. And David Pesetsky needs no introduction. Well, the only thing I want to say is that he has been with us at MYI even before we went virtual. If some of you may remember that we used to be in person in St. Petersburg. David was a participant there, and he's been a participant several times since then in the virtual reality. And we're delighted to have him today to tell us about the shrinker of clauses. No question mark involved. So thank you, David, for coming. Thank you, everybody. Take it away, and we'll put a handout in the chat, which he will also be sharing.
Great. Thank you, John. Let me take a second before I talk more to share the screen, which, because I'm sharing from an iPad via AirPlay, takes a second or two to start up. So and I'll need to rearrange my screen slightly. So give me a second here. So it's still things that used to take a microsecond now seem to take some time. So give me a second here. Okay. Okay. So can I see some nodding heads that I'm successfully screen sharing? Okay, so
you are.
Yeah, so I'm using a handout which is in the chat because it's what I have. For those who prefer slides, my apologies. So a couple things. So first of all, I'm really delighted to have been invited to give this talk. I indeed am an old timer at VNYI and an old timer at NYI, and I think the solution to the pandemic and the other problems that made the St. Petersburg school unable to continue for the time being of taking the NYI experience worldwide is really one of the most important things that's happened in our field. And from the bottom of my heart, I thank John and all the people who've been helping to make it possible. It's the availability of classes and talks in our fields to people around the entire world is something truly extraordinary. It is probably one of the only upsides I can think of to the crazy, complex, often terrible world that we live in at the moment. So thank you, John. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I am indeed a VNYI old timer, and parts of my presentation today will be completely familiar to people who've taken some of my classes over the past couple of years, or people who've been in my class at Kriegling and a few or talks I've given recently. For people who are familiar with some of my recent work, but not with the absolutely latest partial reworking of it, there will certainly be things that are unfamiliar. But if I get going and you say, wait a minute, I've heard all this before and it's a beautiful day and there are other things I have to do, remember that at a Zoom online talk, you can head for the door and I will hardly notice you except as a decrease in the number of integers next to the participants button on my screen. So with that, let me begin the talk. So the broader question that I want to address, which I'm certainly not going to answer, in anything like totality, but which I'd like to raise as part of a research program that we should try to get started, is the question of why there are so many sizes of clauses. Now, I'm suddenly realizing that this handout, which comes from a talk I gave a month ago in Tokyo at the English Linguistic Society of Tokyo, contains the prepositional phrase "in English" in heading number 1. That was my acknowledgement that I was at an English Linguistic Society meeting, but I don't really mean it. The question I really want to ask, and the edit I should have made, is why are there so many sizes of clauses in the languages of the world? Though I will be talking mostly, but absolutely not exclusively, about English here. So there are full finite CPs in a language like English, that clauses like 1a, Mary thinks that Sue is reading a book, but also numerous clause types that are missing elements of their complementizer and their tense aspect and mood and agreement systems that you see displayed in 1, familiar to all of you, I think. Right? So, alongside Mary thinks that Sue is reading the book, the complementizer can be gone in English as in B. There are non-finite variants in which agreement and tense distinctions are gone, as in C through F. The complementizer can be missing, as in D through F, or you can have an infinitival complementizer as in 1C. I think there's a question we should be asking, which is, how does it come about that there's not just one clause size in a language like English? And I think this puzzle is of importance, for two reasons, right? One is the fact that we all spend time on in intro syntax classes, that the multiplicity of clause types interacts with many other phenomena. For example, what kind of subject you can have, where it can or must be located or cannot be located, the availability of topics and other left peripheral elements, the ability of the clause itself to undergo movement. If you eliminate the that from an English finite clause, the clause can't move around the way it can if there is a that, and the semantic interpretation of the clause, which I'm going to have very little to say about today. And the other reason I think why this puzzle is of importance is connected to my apology for not deleting the phrase in English from the section heading, which is the fact that contrasts of a generally similar nature show up not just in English, but in unrelated languages across the globe with many differences of detail. But this suggests that there's something universal about the existence of such diversity. So interaction with other phenomena and ubiquity, I think, make this a puzzle that we should take up. And I want to put this discussion together with something that has been discussed a lot in the context of English and some other languages, but whose importance is perhaps less immediately obvious than the one I just mentioned. What's often called the that trace effect. I prefer to call it the complementizer trace effect, but the that trace effect is its most famous name. And at first glance, this looks like a minor interesting fact about a few languages. So it's the fact that you see demonstrated in two, that if you extract the local subject, and people normally talk about this in the context of what's called A-bar extraction, so rules like WH movement, the complementizer that's normally optionally possible in an embedded finite declarative clause in English must be silent or must disappear, right? So, who do you think that Metsu is not good, but the variant without that, as in 2b, who do you think Metsu is what you have to say. This is not a phenomenon that you find when you're extracting other things other than the local subject. So if you extract the object, for example, of the verb meet, you get the paradigm in 3, where both the version with that and the version without that are equally possible, right? So that's where we are on the handout. Now, when I say that the effect is produced by moving the subject, what do I actually mean by subject? And it turns out that the elements that produce the effect when they're moved in English, for example, roughly coincides to the set of elements that, some of them mysterious, that seem to satisfy the obligatory subject requirement of English clauses. What's called the EPP, or extended projection principle, or extra peripheral position requirement. So, for example, English has, many languages have, the phenomenon that you see in the baseline sentence in 4. It's called locative inversion, where a locational, directional, or dative prepositional phrase seems to be able to satisfy the requirement of English that's otherwise satisfied by boring noun phrase subjects. Things like "in this room" can be found the best examples of Greek sculpture. And if you try to, say, WH move that prepositional phrase that's kind of subject-like, it produces the effect. As Bresnan noted in 1972 dissertation, in which room do you think that can be found the best examples of Greek sculpture is no good unless you get rid of the that, as in 4b. Okay. Similarly, there's a mysterious phenomenon of a similar nature called predicate inversion. Sentences like "even more important than syntax is global warming," which sadly I think is true. And that shows the same kind of effect. If you try to question the "even more important than syntax" phrase, extraction is possible only if the complementizer that is not heard. So how much more important than syntax do you think that is climate change? No good. Leave out the that. How much more important than syntax do you think is climate change? The result is fine.
Is climate Ah, puedo dejarlo así.
Somebody has their microphone on. If you could mute yourself, that would be good. Thanks. Um, uh, Once again, A-bar extraction, I want to point out that A-bar extraction of anything other than these subject-like elements, right, fails to show the effect. You can have the that can be missing, all is fine, right? So that includes, in fact, extraction of a subject that's not the subject right next to the complementizer. So in 6, we're extracting a subject from a very embedded clause, and the middle clause is fine with or without the complementizer, right? So who do you think that they said met Sue? We're extracting a subject, but the complementizer poses no problem. So that trace effect is really about extracting the subject from the same clause as the complementizer. That's under discussion. Similarly, high things that are not subject-like, for example, why in a why question, fails to show that effect. So why did you say that they met Sue has a reading in which you're asking for the reasons why they met Sue, according to what you said, right? And there's no that trace effect. So it's an interesting phenomenon, but it might be less obviously cosmic to you than the question of why languages have different kinds of clauses. So you might ask, why is this puzzle of importance as well? And there is a view out there which might say, well, it's not of importance. There's nothing to see here, folks. Maybe there's nothing deep about that trace effect. It's just an accidental gap, for example, in the data to which English-speaking children are exposed. You grow up never hearing the starred sentences, so you know they're starred. It directly influences the later judgments of speakers. Consistent with this view, right, is the fact that ChatGPT, at least in its GPT-4 version, actually knows that examples that are starred, that instantiate the that trace effect, are errors, right? So here is ChatGPT. We tell it that Mary thinks that David Copperfield and Moby Dick are the 2 most interesting English novels. I ask it a sentence that should have a star in front of it. Which novels does Mary think that are the 2 most interesting? And ChatGPT understands my question, right? That we see here. But then I say, was my question grammatically well formed? And what do you know? ChatGPT says, well, your question contained a slight grammatical error, and it wants to correct it by leaving out the word that, right? So ChatGPT is a machine learning system that has 175 billion parameters trained on a corpus containing 300 billion words, right? Which I'm told is about 3,000 years of nonstop human speech at a very fast speech rate. But at least, this kind of system is getting enough data to know the effect, right? And this kind of data point has been taken by people like Steve Piantadosi to argue that VNYI should eliminate its linguistics component because there really is no linguistics. You can read the quote there, that modern machine learning has subverted and bypassed the entire theoretical framework of Chomsky's linguistics, including its core claims to insights, principles, structures, and processes, everything I'm going to talk about. But the thing is, right, versions of this effect are not limited to English. They're found in languages all over the globe, right? And we don't find an opposite asymmetry or other variants that would be simple to describe in English. So just to take some examples plucked from a summary article I wrote about the effects some years ago, right, in a dialect of Arabic spoken in Lebanon and surrounding areas, studied by my colleague Mike Kenstowitz, we have exactly the same effect. So you have this complementizer inu that's optional, roughly the ways that is optional in English. And if I'm asking which dress did Farid say that the girl bought, questioning the embedded object, inu remains optional. But if I question the subject, as in 8b, which girl Farid said that bought the dress, the that has to be omitted. This looks like the same effect. Or Martina Martinovic, studying language of Senegal, Wolof, unrelated to Levantine Arabic, right, observed that there is a complementizer connected morpheme, this L, that is found I'm sorry, not this L, but this L down here, that is found in the embedded clause when you WH move the object, but this L is impossible when you WH move the subject. And I keep forgetting to give the handout with a C example that shows that there's a version of 9b that's okay that omits the L, but that's the fact. Right? Or in Nupe, distantly related to Wolof, we have a very similar fact that in What Does It Seem That Musa Cooked, the complementizer ke is fine, but that complementizer is impossible in 9b. And now, oh, I see what I'm discovering. What I'm discovering is that these examples should have been examples in 10. It's just a formatting problem that I hope doesn't recur. So, if you're very impressed by the fact that ChatGPT knows the effect, right? There's a, and you think that, we should shut down the linguistics part of VNYI, or at least end my talk here, on account of that, there's a challenge in the universality or the ubiquity of the effect, which is why should the input data to a child just happen to be similar in this fashion in unrelated speech communities, with the result that exactly the same subject, non-subject asymmetry is acquired by children growing up in them, and we don't find opposite asymmetries. And actually, to the extent that we know something about the actual language acquisition process and the that trace effect, we know from some corpus studies of English child-directed and adult-directed speech, that if you're not ChatGPT, getting a corpus of 300 billion words, over 3,000 years, at least if you're a normal human child acquiring English, the actual input data that could teach you that the effect is part of the adult language is so sparse that the acquisition problem is essentially, infinite, right? So you can read the summary here of what Colin Phillips notes, but the relevant examples are extremely infrequent in actual child-directed speech. And furthermore, at least in many cases, when a language fails to show the that trace effect, right, where you could say, well, you see, children learning that language just weren't exposed to the relevant data, there's actually a reason for it, right? What Luigi Rizzi and colleagues have called a skipping strategy. Right? What Rizzi discovered in a famous 1982 paper, reinforced by much literature since then, is that yes, there are languages that do not have the subject-object asymmetry of English, but that's because independently, right, they have the possibility of leaving what in English would be the subject of the sentence in the specifier of TP position, of leaving that subject deep within the verb phrase, so that the laws that govern its extraction are essentially the laws that govern the extraction of objects, not the laws that would govern the extraction of a high subject. So Rizzi had a diagnostic for this that I'm not presenting in full in the handout, but which is the necessity and the possibility when you're asking a question involving a Bayer quantifier of having a clitic of them associated with the Bayer quantifier. That's a property that objects have, but that subjects in spec of TP do not have in Italian, which is a language that lacks this effect. And Rizzi noted that if you're asking a good question in Italian, like how many of them or how many did you say that fell, the complementizer that remains, unlike in English, but you get this ne clitic, this of them word that he independently shows diagnoses the idea that what we've done here is extracted what looks like a subject from a VP internal position. Furthermore, really interesting, but minor details of the problem are also found cross-linguistically. So Joan Dresden observed that the effect goes away, or at least is reduced in English, when adverbials, like say, for all intents and purposes, intervene between the complementizer and what's arguably the subject position in the sentence. So Sue met the man who Mary is claiming that was the mayor of the city, that's bad. But Sue met the man who Mary is claiming that for all intents and purposes was the mayor of the is claiming that for all intents and purposes was the mayor of the city is fine. That little detail is reproduced in Nupe, work of Jason Kandabovich, where the presence of this adverbial before is what gets rid of the that trace effect induced by the complementizer ganan that would otherwise show up in Nupe. And there are examples in Dutch that seem to argue for the same thing. If a prepositional phrase arguably intervenes between the complementizer and the extraction side of a subject, the effect goes away. If the prepositional phrase is located somewhere else, you get a that trace effect back again. So remember, when I was discussing the problem of clause size, right, I asked, why is this puzzle of interest? It was of interest because it interacts with many other phenomena and because it has the property of ubiquity. We find it in unrelated languages across the globe. Right? The trace effect, it turns out, has exactly this property of ubiquity. So I would like to conclude that it, like the problem of clause size, has its roots in some deep property of the human language family. It's not just a trivial fact about the data to which children are exposed. Still, it could be a trivial, unimportant, minor fact about the language faculty. Right? Yeah, it's in UG somewhere, but it's not important. Right? I've heard this view expressed. So then you might say, yeah, life is short. Why should we spend our time caring about it? So we really want to ask, does the that trace effect also interact with many other phenomena? Should it be at the top of our list of things to try to understand if we're a linguist trying to understand the human language faculty? Or is there just some, trivial special footnote in UG labeled the that trace effect, some accidental piece of lawyerly small print, fine print in UG? So I'd like to argue that the that trace effect is actually really important. And it's actually one piece of a much larger generalization that helps us understand the first question that I asked, why clauses come in multiple sizes. So the first thing I'd like to do is broaden the characterization of the that trace problem itself. So first of all, it's not just about silencing the complementizer. This is well known to people in the field, because there are languages that seem to show something that looks like the that trace effect. Extracting the local subject causes problems for the local complementizer. But there are languages that have a way of solving this problem that's not getting rid of the complementizer, but rather changing it in some way. So the most famous example discovered by Perlmutter, who should be but is not credited on my handout here, is the observation that in French, which has this effect, right? So who do you think that Mary has met? Fine. But who do you think that has met Mary? No good. Has the effect with the normal boring form of the complementizer, que. But if you replace the normal boring complementizer que with qui, with an alternative form qui, right? What Perlmutter observed, even though French people sometimes take a moment or two to realize this is true, is that replacing que with this special form qui makes subject extraction possible. So who do you think qui has met Mary? It works out fine. If you know some French and you know that qui, well, you can even see it in 15C, is also the animate WH pronoun who, that's kind of a handout error of mine that I'm demonstrating this to you with a who question. You get the same fact with an inanimate question. So it's not the same key, that's the key of who. And by the way, Boshkovich notes in a footnote of a recent paper that adverbials inserted between the boring complementizer que and the extraction side of the subject improve the that trace effect in French, just as they do in English and Nupe and Dutch. So we really are probably dealing with the same effect here, right? So I think we don't want to think about the that trace effect in English and elsewhere as necessarily deletion or silencing of C. It's doing something to C, reducing it, altering it in some way. And I'm going to speculate that what it's always about is some kind of reduction, that qui has fewer features than que has, though I can't really prove that for que qui. Furthermore, the effect is not just about a bar movement. It's not just about WH movement or topicalization, though that's where it's mostly been studied. Right? So I know at least two, and in a certain sense three, but we don't have time today to discuss the third, languages that clearly show a that trace type effect with long distance A movement, that is movement like raising to subject, for example. So some of you have heard me talk about this elsewhere. This is where you might want to head for the door, but unfortunately, I don't have more than these two languages to present to you. So in a paper by Vicky Karstens and Mike Dirks, they note that in a Bantu language of Kenya, right, you have the general possibility of doing raising to subject from a clause that's basically a finite clause. So it has full agreement. This is the phenomenon known as hyper-raising, when you can do raising from a finite clause. And what they note that's really interesting is that this hyper-raising shows, in essence, that trace effect. So you see in 17a, bold-faced, the complementizer koti, which is one of these say complementizers, in a sentence that has no raising. It appears that the cows have drunk the water. The embedded clause is full and finite. We have class 10 agreement with plural cows. That's what the 10 means. And we have the complementizer koti introducing the embedded clause. If you set up a scenario that makes it clear that we're dealing, with something that has the same semantics as 17a, you could produce a sentence like 17b. The cows appear have drunk the water. Full and finite embedded verb, right? That's the phenomenon called hyperraising. And cows has clearly undergone raising from the embedded clause into the higher subject position. It's not getting a semantic theta roll from the higher verb appear. It's fully compatible with the scenario in which you haven't seen any cows. You're just inferring from the fact that the watering hole is empty, there's no water there, that it's the cows that caused the situation. But the cool thing that they observe is that this kind of raising is incompatible, not possible, with the complementizer koti. This is that trace effect for raising. Jenks and Rose, studying a Kordofanian language from Sudan, have observed a very similar fact for raising to subject and raising to object that I'll skip over. The data seen in 18a through c. Now, it's of course not the case that in all languages that permit hyperraising from a full and finite clause that you get that trace effect, right? So in Greek, for example, you can hyperraise from an embedded clause. The children started that they are running, right? That are running, as in 20, and you don't get rid of the complementizer here. It's the subjunctive complementizer na. But Greek is independently a language that doesn't show that trace effect, even with WH questions, and it's independently a language where the skipping strategy that saves that trace violations for WH movement, is plausibly, we start again, Greek is plausibly a language where the reason you don't get that trace effect with, say, WH movement is that it employs the skipping strategy. It's a language like Italian in which subjects can remain within the VP. So it's not a shock that Greek and many other languages that have hyperraising do not show that trace effect the way Moro and Lusamia do. So that trace effect is not just about getting rid of the complementizer. It's not just about A-bar movement. And it's not even just about long distance A-bar movement, though that's where people first notice the effect. So I showed you earlier in Wolof, right, that there's this L component, at least, to a complementizer that has to disappear when you do long distance A-bar movement of the subject. But in fact, it also has to disappear when you do short distance A-bar movement of the subject. So if I'm saying, who handed the book to Musa? And here I did my job properly of giving you the example that doesn't have the L, right? The L, except I did my job out here of showing you that the L is impossible. The L cannot show up with a local subject question, right? The L does show up, however, and obligatorily, with an object question: who did Musa see? Right? Similarly, in registers of French or dialects of French that don't have what's called the doubly filled comp filter, the replacement of que by my complementizer key. Oh, did I make this mistake again? I made this mistake again. This underline should actually be here, right? So forget the fact that it's here. So in French, right, in registers that can say things like, I wonder who that Mary wanted to see, right? They can also say, I wonder who that wanted to see Mary. But they have to use the form qui rather than the form que. That is the same replacement of que with qui that shows up with long distance WH movement, shows up with short distance WH movement. And the unrelated Gur language, Buli, a language of Ghana, studied by one of our former students, Abdul Razak Sulemana, shows a very comparable alternation between Ati and Ali with the same sort of effect. So it's not, just about a bar movement. It's also about a movement. It's not just about getting rid of the complementizer. It's also about replacing it with a reduced form. And it's not just about long distance movement of the subject. It's also about short distance movement of the subject. And actually, it's not just about reducing C, right? So there's a phenomenon found again in many languages all across the world in which a short distance WH question doesn't necessarily mess with the complementizer, but does mess with the agreement morphology that would otherwise characterize a finite clause. This is what's called anti-agreement, and it's all about extracting the subject, short distance. So in Tamazight Berber, right, in all the Berber languages, in fact, right, where a simple sentence like the woman saw the boys has and requires rich agreement on the verb, third person singular feminine, if you question the subject, right, it's possible, but not with the rich agreement that you have to see on a normal clause. What happens is all or some of the agreement disappears. In Tamazight Berber, it's all of the agreement, right? You get what they call a participial form, but that's basically a finite verb form without any agreement, right? And it's possible that English shows something similar, but I'm going to skip over that. Furthermore, in Italian at least, right, where Rizzi argued, and I didn't present the argument to you, but I just alluded to it, that the possibility and obligatoriness of this clitic ne in how many of them did you say that fell is a sign that the how many WH phrase started from deep within the verb phrase. You actually get the same fact with short distance WH movement of the subject. So how many of them fell, as Rizzi observes at the end of his paper, with a little bit of embarrassment because of the theory that he was developing in that paper, you get exactly the same fact, that this of them has to show up. I don't have time to spell out the entire argument to you, but so it looks like short distance WH movement, right, requires the same skipping in languages like Italian that long distance WH movement of the subject does. So we're dealing with an effect that's really about moving something that has the status of subject, of high subject in some fashion, right? Whether the movement is local or long distance, right, doesn't seem to matter. So we might ask, what do local and long distance a bar movement of the subject, put the a movement aside for a while, have in common? And I'd like to suggest that the answer is the following, that they have in common their first step. So if WH movement out of a clause, right, is successive cyclic, has to stop off in the edge of that clause, then what local and long distance a bar movement of the subject have in common is local movement from spec TP to spec CP. As the first step, in the case of long distance movement, who do you think that he'll say should buy the car as this step, the boldface step, or as the only step, right, in short distance movement, right? Because all a bar movement out of a clause proceeds through its edge. How do we know that all a bar movement out of a clause proceeds through its edge? Well, many of you out there know this, but just to remind you, right, there's oodles of evidence. Right? So for example, there's stranding phenomena where pieces of a WH phrase that's undergone long distance movement are stranded or end up getting pronounced in intermediate specifiers of declarative CPs, like West Ulster pluralizing all, they can be stranded in spec of CP, Afrikaans postpositions, right? English possessives, possessive, and so forth. Plenty of evidence that declarative C in clauses from which a bar extraction has taken place has special properties. For example, languages where that kind of declarative C can attract the verb to it. Right? And evidence from binding theory that landing in intermediate spec of CP permits reflexives to satisfy locality requirements that would otherwise be unsatisfied. That's evidence that you may stop in intermediate specifier of CP positions. There's also oodles of evidence that you must, right? Chomsky first made the proposal that WH movement is successive cyclic because when spec of CP is already occupied by something, it creates an island violation, a WH island effect, right? And there's plenty of other evidence as well that you can read about here. So I'd like to suggest then that indeed WH movement is successive cyclic, so that long distance movement of a subject has to stop off as an initial step in the same position that short distance of subject ends up in, namely the local specifier of CP. So I'd like to suggest that both the that trace family of effects found with long distance A bar movement and similar effects found with short distance A bar movement have the same origin. Namely, it's the consequence of short distance movement to the specifier of CP from the specifier of the next phrase down, the complement of C, which I'm going to call TP, though you may prefer to call it something else, following on the left periphery literature. What I'd like to suggest goes on is what's given in 29 on the handout, namely, whenever you do short distance movement to the specifier of CP from the specifier of the complement of CP, this movement from spec of TP to spec of CP, right, that produces a configuration in which something has to happen to either C or T, right, to reduce it, right? I'd like to suggest that what has to happen is something that was actually first identified by Kasengati Kinyalolo in a UCLA dissertation from 1991 that Vicky Karstens has written about subsequently in a number of papers. And I'm going to call this process Kinyalolo dissimilation after its discoverer. The statement in 29 is mine. So I'm going to suggest that in any situation with this configuration, right, where TP is the complement of C, if you've had movement to T so that T has triggered movement of some phrase, and that same phrase moves then to the specifier of C. So if both T and C have triggered movement of the same phrase, either T or C must undergo featural reduction as a kind of dissimilation phenomenon. Right? So the obvious ancestors of this are in Kinyalolo's own work. Here's his statement as in 30, slightly abbreviated. And I have to acknowledge that I was very inspired in this idea by hearing Will Oxford's incredible talk in 2020 NELS and during the pandemic, where he showed that essentially 29 basically solves almost every salient problem of Algonquian syntax. I'm going to pause here to say something completely unrelated to my talk, which is that I have Venetian blinds right in front of me. And I now remember from the pandemic teaching period that at exactly this time of day, they're closed, the sun shines through them, which sort of projects interesting things on my face if I don't sit exactly here, but there's not a lot I can do about it. So I'll try to get out of the way of the sun, but I can't do that. Many of you will note that the configuration described in 29 is very similar to the situation that's discussed in a rich literature on what's called the anti-locality constraint. This is a literature that looks at exactly this configuration. but declares that the movement that I'm describing here is forbidden. My approach is really quite different, but of course it shares in common with the anti-locality literature the idea that there's something special about the situation described here, where both T and C have triggered movement of the same phrase. But my idea is that, far from being forbidden, successive cyclicity actually requires the anti-locality configuration to be created, but it just says once it's created, something has to happen to either C or T. I apologize for, again, what looks like another formatting problem, but what's being covered up here by the screenshot of the earlier discussion of left interveners and described in the text here is that given the notion that it's crucially this configuration that creates a problem solved by messing with C or with T, it's easy to imagine that the reason putting adverbials and other material in between C and the extraction side of the subject gets rid of the effect is because if the adverbial intervening is the specifier of something other than TP, like if there's a focus phrase or a topic phrase, then extracting the subject from the specifier of TP to the specifier of CP no longer instantiates this situation because the TP is no longer the complement of C. There's a topic phrase or a focus phrase in between. So that's what's unfortunately covered up here. So those of you who are familiar with my exfoliation paper or who heard me talk about it at earlier VNYIs will want to know where I went wrong and where I'm now recanting, right? And I went wrong in many ways, but the two important ones are, first of all, insisting that what we should focus on is getting rid of structure. I think there are configurations where maybe dissimilation does completely get rid of structure, but all I require on this version of the story is that something happened to C or T that makes it different from the way it was before. Speculation, it's a reduction, right? And connected with that in my earlier work was focusing on the notion that what we have to account for is something special to long distance movement, which even then I knew didn't look like it was true, and I had to say all sorts of complicated things to make it true. So that's all I'm going to say about my earlier proposal. But if you've heard me talk or read a paper that had this word exfoliation, it's kind of almost gone from this story. While at the same time, the story might be slightly boring to you because much of the story remains the same, but it just, I think, in an improved version. So now let's go back to the question of why there are different kinds of clauses. For example, where do infinitives come from? Why are there finite and non-finite clauses? Now, to answer this question the way I'd like to suggest we should answer it, I want to observe something first about Kinyalolo dissimilation. Right? Kinyalolo dissimilation describes a circumstance, right? It's this structure where TP is the complement of C, and both T and C have triggered movement of the same phrase. That's when dissimilation happens, right? And I want to insist that that's the only circumstance under which dissimilation happens. That you get Kinyalolo dissimilation only when the rule says it does. So it's a rule, right? Okay. So I've been talking about this as a rule, as a process. We'll get back to that in a moment. But I want to observe that putting aside English complementizer finite clauses that I'm actually not going to return to unless you ask about it, Kinyalolo dissimilation, this kind of reduction, is really limited to subject extraction environments. So for example, in French, right, you replace que with qui when you're extracting the subject, short distance or long distance, right? You can't just do it because you feel like it in an environment where the subject has not been extracted. Right? So, for example, if you're extracting the object, what person do you think that Marie has met? You have to use the normal boring complementizer que. You can't use qui. So, looked at from a perspective that actually will be familiar to people who know my earlier exfoliation work, right? Another place where subject extraction in English can be understood as a prerequisite to the use of reduced forms of C and or T is raising constructions, right? English being a non-hyper-raising language. So in raising to subject, which I call R1, and raising to object, which I call R2, which is actually movement to the specifier VP of the higher clause, only when the subject has raised is an infinitive permitted in the first place, right? Which I think recalls the fact that only when you've extracted the subject by a bar movement in French is the replacement of que by qui permitted, right? So when Bill believes Mary quite sincerely to have solved the problem, we have raising into the higher VP of Mary, right? And we can and must have an infinitive here in English. Likewise, raising to subject, Mary seems to have solved the problem. You can and must have an infinitive when you raise the embedded subject into the subject position of the higher clause. When you haven't done the raising, no infinitive. Infinitive is bad, right? And assuming that no raising to object is possible with adjectives or passive verbs or nouns, right? No infinitive is also possible. Now, we don't usually talk in syntax classes about the non-finiteness of the embedded clauses as a process triggered by the raising of the subject, right? Instead, we usually talk about it in the exact opposite way. We take a lexicalist view of non-finite clauses. We assume that a non-finite clause is born non-finite, right? The result of merging stuff that will build a non-finite as opposed to a finite clause, right? And then we say it's the non-finiteness of the embedded clause that forces the subject to raise, maybe because non-finite T doesn't assign case to its specifier. But I'd like to propose, and this is in keeping with the earlier version of this work that some of you have heard me talk about, right, that this way of talking about it has things backwards, that it's not non-finiteness that entails extraction of the subject, but extraction of the subject that entails non-finiteness in raising constructions in non-hyper-raising languages. So I'm going to take a non-derivationalist view of non-finite clauses, right, and put forward the tenets in 35. Every embedded clause is born as a full finite CP, starts out its life as a that clause with a full tense and agreement. And it's only Kinyalolo dissimilation which responds to raising from spec TP to spec CP when TP is the complement of C, that is licensed to reduce C or T. That's the only time in which it happens. Right? This, of course, means that a movement raising, like a bar movement, proceeds through the specifier CP, responding to a phi probe on C, so there's no ban on improper movement. We can discuss that more in the question period if you want. Sorry, I'm having trouble with my toolbar here. Is that going to disappear? No, I've done something to my screen, but I'll try to live with it. There we go. Okay. So in something like, Bill believes Mary quite sincerely to have solved the problem, Mary stopped off in spec of CP. And in Mary seems to have solved the problem similarly. This, of course, predicts that case is irrelevant to the correlation between subject raising and non-finiteness, that it's just about the raising. And this actually appears to be true, as I've argued in the exfoliation manuscript that some of you know, right? So things like CP subjects, predicative and inversion subjects, fronted locatives, right? Expletives like there, right? Show the same correlation between the possibility and obligatoriness of having an infinitive clause downstairs in English, right? That nominals show, right? So, sorry, I'm having a little trouble with my screen, right? But it looks like it's not the case that the raising paradigm that you see in, let's say 33 up here. Sorry. How did we ever get through the pandemic? That you see in 33 over here, right, reproduces itself with anything, well, in the case of predicative inversion and fronted locatives, that we independently saw earlier produces a bat trace effect when you're WH moving it. Right? So it really looks like it has nothing to do with case, right? That we had things wrong all along It's not building a non-finite clause that forces us to extract the subject for some reason, right? Rather, it's extracting the subject that forces the clause to become non-finite. So you might ask at the same time, is Kinyalolo dissimilation a derivational process, right? Or maybe could it be a surface filter or something like that? And again, here quoting from my own earlier work that some of you may know and some of you may not know, right? I think there's evidence that Kinyalolo dissimilation is a derivational process because we have derivational opacity arguments. So for example, in Icelandic, there's a famous puzzle for traditional case theory that comes from the fact that Icelandic has an English-like raising to object construction in a language that also has rich morphological case and has quirky case constructions in which the subject bears, for example, dative, right? And the object bears nominative. Right? So constructions like the child dative recovered from the disease nominative. This construction supports the general view that nominative is somehow connected to agreement from the fact that the nominative objects that you see in 41, right, trigger number agreement on the verbs. So the child singular dative recovered from the disease singular nominative, third person singular verb. But the child singular dative recovered from the diseases plural nominative gives you plural agreement on the verb. This suggests, perhaps correctly, right, that nominative case is a reflex in some sense of number and arguably person agreement with the finite verb, with T. Raising a terrible puzzle, right? From the fact that if you have a dative subject nominative object clause embedded in a raising to object construction, right, where there is no visible agreement on the embedded verb, you might expect the embedded object to not be able to get case at all and the result to be a star, right? But not only is the result not a star, but you still get nominative case down there. Right? This has been a puzzle that has led some people to abandon the traditional theory of nominative case entirely. The puzzle actually goes away, right, if we assume that the life history of the embedded clause in the raising to object construction, like 42, is the following, right? The embedded clause in 42 actually started out full and finite. Doctor believes that the child, dative, full and finite verb recovered from the disease. Right? That a raising to object probe somewhere in the higher VP, right, is responsible for the possibility of the embedded subject moving to spec of CP and then moving into the higher VP. That creates a Kinyalolo dissimilation configuration to which the English's response is reducing C and T. Why? I can talk about that, but not in this talk, right? So we get both C and T reduced, right? The embedded dative subject raises into the higher verb phrase, and the infinitive character of the embedded clause is the result, not the cause, of the embedded dative subject raising. The nominative case that we see on the embedded object was boringly assigned by the embedded clause T at a time in the derivation when it was full and finite. What makes us think, independent of this, that it was ever full and finite? Well, the most popular theory of why reflexives are blocked in languages like English or Icelandic in embedded clauses like Mary believes that herself gave a good talk, star, is that there's some poisonous relation between agreement and reflexives. And arguments in favor of what's called the anaphor agreement effect explanation of 43 include the fact that in languages without subject agreement, nominative reflexives are generally okay. Right? that in languages with object agreement, object reflexives become not okay, and languages often invoke special strategies to permit object reflexives or subject reflexives to escape the poisoning property of agreement. And if you go and look at raising to object constructions in Icelandic nominative object clauses, you find an additional argument that the embedded clause started out its life with agreement in the fact that reflexives are not possible as nominative objects in raising to object clauses as in 46. So in I believe Maria dative to find boring reflexive, the reason that's starred, right, should be that it's an anaphor agreement effect. But we don't see any agreement in the embedded clause. But if embedded infinitival clauses started out their lives full and finite, right, then earlier in the derivation, there was agreement in the embedded finite clause, and we have a reason why you can't have a reflexive nominative object. So let's take stock, right? I'm almost done. So the main point, I think, is that there's evidence for this process, this Kinyalolo dissimilation process, that shows its face in the languages of the world as a reduction of C or a reduction of T, the head of the complement of CP, in a very specific configuration, movement to the specifier of CP from the specifier of the complement of C. And this generalization turns out to interact with many of the most discussed and salient aspects of syntax. So if you were paying attention, it actually gave us a new argument for successive cyclicity, specifically the need for cross-clausal movement to stop at the clause edge, because longest and subject extraction triggers dissimilation by virtue of the obligatoriness of its first step, the not only legal but required anti-local first step. And both long distance and short distance subject extraction trigger Kinyalolo dissimilation effects, something that my own earlier exfoliation work failed to account for properly. If I'm correct that in essence, the infinitival property of raising constructions in language like English, right, is a that trace effect of a certain sort, right? This provides new support for the formal unity of A and A bar movement. That's significant because, of course, we have different names for them, A and A bar movement, because they differ in certain ways. And there are prominent alternative approaches to syntax, lexical functional grammar, HPSG, head-driven phrase structure grammar, and others that deny the unity of, say, WH movement and raising as processes that are fundamentally the same, whatever the other differences might be, right? Because both A movement and A bar movement in multiple ways I've shown today yield Kinyalolo dissimilation effects. And it supports, interestingly, a crucially derivational model of syntax, a topic that's been much debated over the years, right? Given the existence of derivational opacity arguments, nominative objects in Icelandic correlating, that otherwise correlate with agreement in clauses where you don't see any agreement, in clauses that act like they used to have agreement because these nominative objects, in fact, show an anaphor agreement effect in the phenomena that we just looked at, that they can't be reflexives. So we have evidence for a crucially derivational model of syntax, given the existence of derivational opacity arguments. Arguments for a stage in the derivation of smaller than full clauses in which they are full and finite. Now, one final coda, it might not have escaped your attention that in talking about infinitives, I've been talking exclusively about raising constructions, which many languages have, but many more languages do not have, at least not in infinitival form. What's much more common cross-linguistically are non-finite clauses in control constructions. Right? So are they also the result of Kinyalolo dissimilation? Well, Idam Landau, in his book from a few years ago, has argued, following an earlier insight of Gennaro Cerchia, that control constructions, at least obligatory control constructions, involve a semantically vacuous minimal pronoun that's done something interesting, namely moving from spec TP to the local spec of CP. Kierkegaard's idea is that these embedded clauses have the semantics of a property. And if we believe that movement always creates a phrase with the semantics of a property, right, by lambda abstraction applying to the sister of the landing site, right, then control infinitives following Landau, look roughly like 47. Right? Maybe try is or is not the right verb to use here, but Mary planned to VP. Right? We have pro undergoing short distance movement, right, which produces a semantics, right, that sort of, looks like, I'm trying to draw something but not succeeding. Looks like, pick the right tool, David. Yes, excellent. Looks sort of like, this, right, which should have been on the handout, right? And of course, this is a Kinyalolo configuration, right? So it's, not a shock, right, that languages often show reduction in the T or C system, or in the English case, both, right, in precisely control configurations as well. And by the way, property denoting infinitives, can serve as relative clauses. The paradigm case of properties in sentences like the first person to speak yesterday was Mary, that you see in 48, where traditional case theory has always seen this as a puzzle, right? Because looks like we don't have any case in the position that looks like it should be filled by a semantic variable, which when nominal otherwise needs case in relative clauses and questions. So I think, obviously my goal here is, to take over the world and explain everything in it. That is to answer the initial question about why there are multiple clause sizes, and obviously I haven't yet achieved this imperialist, in the good sense, scientific goal of mine. Many things I haven't discussed an explanation for here, right? But I think all in all, there's enough evidence that it's at least plausible that the distribution of smaller than full clauses has something to do with Kinyalolo configurations, right? So it's plausible, for example, in the case of control, though I haven't worked out the details for the reasons that I just gave, right? And the prospect of uniting an A bar movement and the other sort of consequences of the proposal that I made today, up to you to judge, but they might be compelling enough to suggest that this talk is not completely on the wrong track, in the issues with which it began. So raising as a question of interest, right, why there are many different clause types, and suggesting that the answer is related to something seemingly technical, right? Short distance movement of the subject, right? That it's the paradigm, the patterns of short distance movement of the subject that languages permit, allow, require in different configurations, and the precise kinds of alterations to C and T triggered by Kinyalolo dissimilation that languages specify when this happens, that accounts for the superficial, wide variety of different clause types that we see in the languages of the world. The most salient topic that I haven't discussed here is, well, what are the laws that govern language to language? Which head is reduced by Kinyalolo dissimilation? And I'm happy to discuss this. I have some ideas about it, but they don't completely work. And this is one of the most important problems that I've been working on trying to solve here. So nothing conclusive, no infallible predictions. Alas, on that down note, let me end by thanking you all and taking, I guess, as much time as you need up till the half hour for your questions. So thank you all, and happy to take your questions. John, will somebody else be calling on people?
Thank you, David. Yeah, I can. We can do that, and we started about 10 after, so we do have at least until the half hour for people who are able to stay and want to participate. I think it would be best for people if you unshare your screen. If you need to come back to it, we can do that. And if people can turn their cameras on for the discussion, because it's always nice to see your audience and see who's there, whoever can, and just use your little electronic or real hands if you want to have a question or a comment.
I'll put the handout to the screen in the chat again for anybody who missed it.
Yes, that'd be great. The handout will be there. The talk is also recorded and will be and it was streamed on Facebook, so it will be available there if you want to look at it again. We have a comment in the chat. Elmira, would you like to voice your question, or do you want someone to read it out for you, or
Let me say before, the questions of the form I didn't understand, section 29, can you go over it again, are very welcome, because I don't know the audience and you all have very different backgrounds.
So I see. So I'll read Elmira's question. Thank you for the talk. It was great. I think it would be very interesting to look into one of the South Slavic languages, Bosnian, for example, because embedded clauses always come with overt complementizer, and non-finite clauses can only have pro-subjects. In Bosnian, for example, we have subject and object movement without that effect. That was Elmira's comment. She wasn't able to speak it with audio problems. So
yeah, actually, thank you for the question. So actually have some material on extraction in Bosnian in particular, and in the neighboring languages, where there's an interesting contrast. Why specifically raising and control should differ in the degree of reduction that they allow falls into the downer category at the end of my talk, right? So I would like to suggest some success in diagnosing where you have short distance subject movement and the response is reduction, but not success in exactly knowing what kind of reduction you get where. So so it's kind of easy for me to say, okay, this language does this and this language does this other thing. Harder for me to tackle an issue like, here's a language that does hyper raising, so you're not fully reducing the content of tense in a movement construction, out of the clause, long distance A movement, but not in a short distance A movement control construction. That's indeed a very, very significant puzzle for me at the moment.
thank you. Other questions, comments? So another one in the chat. Anastasia, would you like to read it, or do you want me to read it? I'm happy to read people's questions. It's fine. Unless Anastasia jumps in, I'm going to do that. Can clauses, so here, David, here's the question. You probably see it in the chat. Can clauses change their size through backward processes after movement of XP, or are there effects like look ahead? In what time do they become truncated?
Yeah, so certainly I don't want a clause that's gotten small to get bigger again, though that's an intriguing idea. But indeed, there is an undercurrent of look ahead issues, of one sort or another in the story. I think it's well, actually the place where the most serious look ahead issues arise is in a part of the story that I didn't tell today, involving how you end up reducing both C and T in English. But even so, there's a question. Let's say if you're raising the subject to spec of CP, do you wait until it moves on, in the case of long distance movement, to mess with CP, or does it happen immediately? And so I'm sorry, I'm not getting a very coherent answer to the question. Let me just sort of start again. There are places in which a look ahead issue arises for me, but they're in areas of the story that I didn't talk about today. So I think, actually, contrary to what I started babbling about a moment ago, insofar as I discussed Kinyalolo dissimilation in the talk today, there's no intrinsic look ahead issue, except insofar as we all have this question of when movement to a local spec of CP is licensed because you're moving further, right? What is the logic of that, right? So, I can't, for example, in English, randomly, because I feel like it, move a subject into, say, spec of CP and reduce as a result of that, say, the clause to an infinitive. So there is the standard look-ahead problem about successive cyclicity that I face in the same way that everybody faces. There is an additional look-ahead problem that you can't know about because I didn't talk about that stuff that I'm sort of battling with at the moment. And if you had something else in mind, please chime in and I'll try to answer your question better.
Thank you. We have a couple of hands. First Paulina, then Susie. Paulina, hi.
Thank you so much. That is really interesting and exciting. And it made me think about agent focus constructions in Mayan languages, because it seems that if you extract the agent, like the transitive subject, you have problems unless you change the construction. And there is an account that says that it's because there is an object, like high absolute object, that is like in the way, and you cannot extract the subject. But actually, some recent accounts of like certain object agreements show that objects not always move up, and like even in that situation, we do need agent focus. So it seems that it's not that there is an object over there, but there is something else. And I exactly thought about like the two specifiers too close together. So I've just been wondering whether you thought about this kind of things and whether those can be relevant here, like agent focus.
Thank you. So I'm not really going to answer your question because I can't. So first of all, for people out there who may not know, I mean, agent focus is the name in Mayan for something that's not really about agents and not necessarily about focus, right? But it's about, a different and reduced agreement pattern that shows up in a subset of the Mayan languages when you're trying to do local A-bar extraction of the subject. And of course, I've always cherished the hope that there's an account of agent focus that puts it together with the that trace effect, because it sort of feels in many ways to me like it belongs there. But there's a lot to study about agent focus, and so I haven't done that, which is why I don't talk about it and haven't reached that. Indeed, sort of a salient account due to Jessica Kuhn and Pedro Mateo Pedro and Omer Preminger and other people, relates it to the position of absolutives and to the presence or absence of a barrier. There's a terrific account that, by Elise Newman, who I see in the audience, but it's not the only reason I'm praising her account is terrific. In her dissertation, forthcoming monograph, which she may well be discussing in her VNYI course that will start soon. I mean, none of these make the connection that to that trace phenomena, but all of them raise, sort of questions that I would have to answer before I go there. So the short version of my response is yes. I would like to investigate the idea that, terrific though Elise's work is, and fantastic though, Kuhn et al.'s work is, the right way to approach this is as a Mayan-specific instantiation of the things I've been talking about here. But that's not a result I have, and that's work that I haven't done. So if any of you would like to investigate that, please let me know what your results are, because that would be exciting.
Thank you. So Susie and then Mikhail.
Hi, thank you for the nice talk. So I have a possibly technical question and a general comment regarding hyperracing. Yeah. So for hyperracing, I'm wondering if you have evidence that it really patterns with the that trace effect, as opposed to just a general constraint against a movement across CPs. The trouble is that in hyperraising, the majority of languages have allow only the subject to hyperraise, in which case you can't show that object hyperraising would be possible, right? Because that trace effect only applies to subject raising and not to object movement. So the question is simply, do you have evidence that you get that trace effect for a movement as opposed to simply a blocking effect of the CP for a movement?
That's a good question. So lying behind, behind your question, is there the idea that when you don't hear, say, complementizer Koti and Lusamia, it's smaller than a CP, so it's just a size restriction on what you can get out of? No, at present, I don't think I can argue against an alternative that says, it looks like that trace effect, but it really isn't. Let me just think for a minute.
So in the work with Magdalena Loninger and Iva Kovac, we do have some languages where hyperraising is not restricted to the subject. They may be different in various ways, but I think you would want to look at a language like that, where you can, in principle, also do hyperraising of the object across a subject, so you don't get a minimality. And I guess in such a language, you would be able to tell whether it's the subject movement that triggers that trace effect and not the object hyperraising, basically. So I'm not sure if it will be possible, but that's...
So suppose we found a language that permits, hyperraising, by which I assume you mean we know that the ultimate landing site is in a position.
Correct. Yeah.
Right. So I mean, in response to and with that trace effect. So you have to get rid of an otherwise possible or obligatory that. So one question might be. So this would link up with a question that's also somewhat open for me, which is what, if anything, remains of the so-called ban on improper movement. So it's crucial for what I talked about today to be, to survive, that a movement can proceed through the spec of CP. My hopeful thought is that that's connected to the idea that if you got into the spec of CP, as a response to a phi probe on C, it counts as a movement, and then you can move on to an A position. With that in mind, why should an object ever be able to undergo hyperraising? Well, one answer could speculatively be that it underwent some kind of movement internal to the clause, lower than CP, that put it in a position higher than the subject. Maybe it became an outer specifier of T, for example, in which case we might actually expect that trace effect to show up for the subject. It would be kind of analogous to the fact that we get that trace effect and also raising infinitivization with locatives and locative inversion and predicates and predicative inversion in English. So you could imagine a scenario where first the subject becomes the closest A position nominal to C, and then it's what gets targeted by the phi probe on C. So, so if I found what you were thinking one might find someday, that might be a response, right? Whether that constitutes, hey, my theory works, or, well, yeah, you managed to wiggle out of it, but it was wiggling out, would remain to be seen. So that might be a way of thinking about why these languages exist in the first place that might be compatible with a finding like the one you're asking about. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. We are going to fit both of the two questions that hands are up. So there's no function on Zoom where you can block further hand raising, but consider further hand raising blocked because we have 5 minutes left. So 5 minutes, David, is what we have left for Mikhail and Nancy.
Okay, I'll try to answer.
Mikhail, go ahead.
Thank you for a very inspiring talk. I wanted to ask you about extraction from subject in doubly embedded clauses. Maybe I think you said at some point that there is no that trace effect, right?
Correct.
So that can remain there, and you have an example on the slide. I was wondering about your prediction. Is this supposed to be possible on your account, or
Well,
do you predict that? Yeah.
Let me clarify. So if you're extracting the subject of the lowest of three clauses, right, there will be that trace effect in the lowest clause that it's coming from, right? The point, I probably wasn't clear at the time and why I brought up the example. It's just suppose somebody says, the effect says you can never extract something called a subject from a clause that's introduced by that, right? That would predict that if you extract the subject of clause number 3, clause number 2 in the middle, right, can't have an overt complementizer. That's not true, right? So it's really all about moving the local spec of the local spec of TP to the spec of CP immediately above it. So I never came back to that. We're about to run out of time. What I'd like to do is reshare the screen and point to the example. Your facial expression suggests I wasn't clear.
I would like to see the example, maybe, if you have time. So
for you, let's communicate separately. Let me just say it again in words so we can go to Nancy's question. So Kinyalolo dissimilation applies when you have very, very local spec to spec movement, right? If we have 3 clauses, Mary said that, John thinks that, who left the room, right? Only the movement of who inside the lowest clause, right, will be relevant to Kinyalolo dissimilation, because only that is movement from spec of TP to the C immediately above it. If that who then moves into the middle clause, that's not the configuration that triggers Kinyalolo dissimilation, because if you remember the sentence, John is the subject of the middle clause, and it didn't move anywhere.
But I still, sorry, if we have time, I still don't understand why we still can have that in the lowest clause. Because
no, I think I didn't state the facts clearly enough. You cannot have that in the lowest clause. So let me utter 2 sentences, and I'll write them in the chat as well. So who did Mary say that? Parenthesis around that. John thinks, parenthesis star, that was here. So in the chat, we now have, who did Mary say that John thinks was here? Fine. Who did Mary say John thinks that was here? Bad. Right?
Okay. Yeah, I see it now.
Okay, great. Nancy, thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, I'm curious about implications for languages that don't have T or might not have T. So
very good question, and we're almost out of time, which is fortunate because I have no answer for it. My grandest imperialist but benign ambition would be that all languages start out with exactly the same kind of clause. So the subject must be moving somewhere if you don't have T. That's probably not true, right? So there's a less ambitious version of it, which is all clauses start out full and finite, whatever that means in your language. Yeah, so if your lexicon doesn't have past and present, but only has imperfect and perfective, your fullest possible clause is what you have to generate. So that's probably my, if I had to place bets, that's probably what's going to turn out to be the right answer. Though it would be, incredibly interesting if one could argue, for what Emmett Bach once called the universal base hypothesis, that no, the right answer is all languages start out with exactly the same set of resources, and it's the syntax, that makes languages different in that respect. The short version of the answer to your question is I don't know, right? Which brings us to 12:30.
Right, on that note, that's a great note to end the discussion. Thank you, David.
All talks ultimately have to end with I don't know. Right? Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for coming. And please tell your students, friends, and colleagues about the Winter VNYI coming up. We also have a discussion of Jay Kaiser's recent talks coming up this Thursday. Have to plug future events, and the glowing talk of Charles Rees is on Friday. And thank you all. Have a great day wherever you are, or evening, night, morning. And thank you, David, for
Thank you all for coming once again. Thank you so much.